panelists, participants, be very welcome. Welcome everyone to this webinar under the title Education and Training Policies in Response to COVID-19 in the Mediterranean. Welcome. This title launches a crucial question 1 year after the eruption of the pandemic. Do education and training policies in the Mediterranean address the challenges for a sustainable recovery? I'm honored to be moderating this webinar today, organized by the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association and the European Training Foundation. And the purpose of this session is to present, of course, also to discuss, but to present the main findings of a new study and to discuss the latest policies developments in the field of education and labor markets taken by the Mediterranean countries towards a sustainable recovery path. It's a pleasure having today experts, researchers, and decision makers that will give insight about the real socioeconomic impact that the COVID-19 has had in the Mediterranean region, focusing mainly, as I said, in the education, training, and of course, in labor markets. And before starting some logistical matters, I like to recall that the webinar contents and discussions are public and are live broadcasted on Facebook. And the EMEA team will later publish the recording of the session and a report that will summarize the main discussion points. Also for participants, I like to recall that they can write their questions and comments on the Q&A box and the panelists on the chat box. So that said, let's start. Let me introduce Professor Reem Ayadi, who is founder and president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. She's founder and director of the Euro-Mediterranean Network for Economic Studies, senior advisor at the Center for European Policy Studies, professor at the Business School, City University of London, and member of the Center for Banking Research, also academic member and chair of the European Banking Authority Banking Stakeholders Group. She's also associated scholar at the Center for Relationship Banking and Economics at the LUMSA University in Rome. Professor Ayadi, good morning. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for your kind introduction. I'm very pleased today to launch our new study on the education and training policies in response to COVID-19, preparing for recovery. The study has been already online, so everybody who is interested to read it is freely accessible on our website. So our study has been made possible with the support of the European Training Foundation, and I would also like to thank my co-author Sara Ronco, who is a researcher at EMEA, and all the teams of the Euro-Mediterranean Network for Economic Studies, who have been providing inputs on the different countries in the Mediterranean in terms of their education systems and policies during the pandemic. This is an important exercise which gives the first overview on how education and training systems have fared during the pandemic and what should be done. So I don't know if my slides are on screen. So please, if we can move to the next slide. So this study provides an overview on the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 in the Mediterranean countries. We focused on several countries in the Mediterranean South and East, with the focus, as I said, on training, education and training systems and policies and reforms. Our main assessment is to try to examine the resilience based on a model that we have developed last year at EMEA, which we call the mutually interactive three-pillar systems to assess resilience overall. That can be applicable to many sectors, and this relies on the level of preparedness, early warning systems, capacity of the education system to face whatever crisis, in this case is the pandemic, is the health crisis, crisis management system, which activates in reality the policies to face the crisis, and then obviously the crisis recovery system, which ensures the recovery from the crisis. So really, it's the capacity of any sector or any system to face a shock, an external shock. And we applied this thinking and assessment to the education and training systems in the Mediterranean countries. And then obviously later on, we try to provide certain policy recommendations which can be put for discussion with the discussant today. Now I'll go fast on what we have produced. So next slide, please. On the socioeconomic impacts and mitigation policies during the pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, most countries worldwide adopted preventive and containment measures to contain the spread of the virus. With border closures, supply chain disruptions, global trade collapsed, and all of this has been very disruptive worldwide. Even if we look at the remittances, they have declined substantially, unemployment increased almost everywhere, with practically women and youth being the most affected categories worldwide. So if we look at the data, which is published since January 2021, around 93% of the world workers were in countries with some form of workplace closures. So this has been very largely disruptive everywhere. Also, if we look at the working hours, there has been huge losses in terms of during this pandemic, if we compare, for example, to the 2009 global financial crisis. Now, in 2020, we can see that the employment losses were relative term higher for women. Again, as I mentioned, women and youth have been really very much suffering from this losses in the work overall. Now, many countries have seen some economic shrinkages, and this has been the evidence over the last months, combined with very big declines in fiscal revenues. And this, we've seen it. And at the same time, there has been a trend toward more indebtedness. So if we look at all of this, we can see that the children and youth in the future will have to bear this burden of this debt in the future. Now, looking at the countries, our countries of assessment, these countries have been characterized by already, before the crisis, some socioeconomic challenges because they have been in a transition process. And the pandemic breakout, in fact, has even caught those countries in different stages of reform processes. And this has been also confirmed by the European Training Foundation assessment. So yes, the Arab Mediterranean countries have seen quite of, I would say, advances in the education levels and attainment, human capital attainment over the years before, in fact, the pandemic, and they have tried really hard to invest further in their education policies and improving the situation in this field. However, this improvement has not been translated into an improvement in the labor market outcomes. And we've seen that we experience in these countries very high level of unemployment, mainly for the youth and women, and large proportions of informal employment, also high inactivity levels among the youth particularly, and women. Now, if we look at the inequality, the region already has a clear dichotomy between rural and urban, and huge disparities in terms of revenues, but also in terms of geographical disparities, especially in terms of unemployment, where also the informality is putting a lot of pressure on employment in that respect as well. So this inequality, I would say, that has been enhanced during the global pandemic and pushing further the poverty and debt levels, which in reality this has reduced the room for maneuver via the safety net in order to respond to the shocks by the government. Now, if we see what our study finds out is that the pandemic has simply, as you can see in this slide on the impact, has in reality exacerbated the situation in the Mediterranean countries. And we can clearly see that there has been massive job disruptions and losses. This is also coupled by with scarce social security coverages and safety net. And then this has also has been difficult and challenging for the government to channel these safety nets, particularly in the informal sectors, which found their situation even further more precarious. Now, I mean, if we see this graph that on the level of preparedness during the first wave of the pandemic, and also the second wave, was probably the third wave, and whatever waves we are still having to see, the economic policy responses of this region was much below global averages because of this lack of maneuver by the governments they have. And later on, the second wave has even continued this further deterioration in terms of economic and social stability in the majority of these countries, which made the policy response of the government even further complicated. So this is why, you know, they were fluctuating between opening and closing over the period. Now, of course, those countries try to extend the main economic measures during the pandemic, for example, trying to do some tax deferrals, postponement of bill payments, guarantees, public guarantees. The public guarantees have been quite substantial during this crisis, trying really to tackle, you know, a speedy deterioration of the overall socioeconomic conditions and situation of these countries. Of course, there are differences between countries, and the study informs very much what are those differences. Now, in terms of supporting the workers during this crisis, there were, of course, some unemployment insurance for those who have the possibility to get the unemployment insurance. There were some wage subsidies, other quick measures to support salaries, and all of this. But again, sometimes, again, and I repeat, the informality made the situation even more challenging and more complicated over time. So if I repeat what I said before, I mean, the two vulnerable groups that have been really suffering the most during this, even, you know, where the government is trying to target those measures, are women and youth. And I think a very clear targeted action on women and youth is needed, really, for you know, to address this disastrous effect of the pandemic. So I would like to move to the next slide, please. And I want to focus on the education and training system during the pandemic, which is the main purpose of the study, because of course at the beginning we try to go through the overall socioeconomic conditions to know where we are, okay, because this is very important to assess, in fact, the education training system over time during this pandemic, and how we're going to move forward for the recovery path. I mean, I don't want to repeat that the impact of COVID-19 has been extremely detrimental onto education and training systems worldwide. And the Mediterranean countries were caught largely unprepared to face this overwhelming contagion. So if we look at the data, around 80% of the world student population, almost 1.3 billion children and youth in 138 countries, were concerned by school closures, and this is worldwide. And then if you go further, 94% of the students worldwide were kept away from the schools. And this is really quite dramatic. Later on, of course, the government tried to minimize the country closures of certain schools, moving to partial and or local specific closure strategy. This seems to be, in fact, the prevailing one since the second wave, which is in 2020, last year. And then this school closure was applied to many countries over time. I think this has been rather, in my view, dramatic because you see schools also are very important for low-income families, sometimes also to access support, food, incentives, both in financial and in terms of financial and non-financial, and also to address structural inequalities. So this has been also probably a factor that exacerbated poverty and enhanced inequality over the period. I mean, I don't want to go further onto this, but the slide you have in front of you shows, the implications of the school closures and how those countries have dealt with the pandemic to keep everybody at home and trying eventually to have their education via online platforms. But then again, via online platforms, it depends also on the preparedness of the countries in terms of digitalization and digital platforms, if they are developed or not. And this also raises the issue of the digital divide. Next slide, please. And this is my last slides, Cristina. So I'll try to conclude. Now, what we tried here to do in the next slide is to assess how resilient are those education and training systems in the Mediterranean countries. And I mentioned before, we used this model of resilience we developed last year. And practically speaking, the result of the analysis applying this three-pillar system shows a quite gloomy, in a way, assessment on the preparedness. Overall, all the countries are weakly prepared in terms of their education training system to such a shock. There are structural and societal problems which are further deteriorated and hampered by the pandemic, which in fact undermined in a certain way the government's extensive effort to build functioning blended education and training systems, particularly blending it with the digital platforms and so on. In terms of crisis management, I think the emergency protocols that have been put in place were not necessarily very well structured, in the majority of the cases. And the management of the pandemic, at least for the sector, for the education and training sector, has really relied mainly on closing and opening schools, depending on the epidemiological situation during the pandemic. And in reality, we could not find any specific measures to manage the training sector. I mean, overall, from a public policy point of view. In terms of the recovery, we didn't see that there is financial resources and plans to mobilize financial resources in this sector. So there is a need to think substantially on how to mobilize financial resources to deal with certain pandemics or other external shocks in the future. And also, there is complete lack of plans to reorganize the educational and training sector, empowering infrastructures, either physical or digital or both, and also in close collaboration with the private sector. I think the private sector, partnership with the private sector has proven to be very important in a period of shock, because then you pull the resources from private and public, and then you move on to find the solution together. So, of course, we expanded in the study on these 3 pillars. So I invite you to read these parts, which can give you certain ideas. And of course, we can discuss those ideas. Now, at last, I want to give some recommendations, and I close there, that could be considered for the reform processes if there would be a reform processes going forward. Number 1 is to develop systems for assessing and monitoring the preparedness of schools, students, and teachers, and also try to understand and monitor the psychological effect on how they deal with the certain pandemics. It's very important to have this, assessment that could be embedded in the training and system overall. And then there should be reforms to continue, in fact, reforming the professional development of teachers, and to follow up also on the capacities of the students to absorb certain shocks over time. And start giving probably already incentives to involve the private sector and to develop those partnerships also with the civil society, with the NGOs, and then develop new methods and business models to deliver training activities and education activities overall. Now, in terms of crisis management, let's assume we are talking about other pandemics, but of course, crises and shocks, they can be of multitude of sources, can be anything else. Should be some protocols with precise and standardized methods that could be effected right away and then applied to all the countries, okay, not in some pockets, and regions. This is important. Also, as I mentioned, to have a mechanism to face distress, private and public together, not, because otherwise you enhance the inequality and you further, deteriorate the poverty. And then finally, to increase again private-public partnership and put the financial resources to ensure that, for example, you have the capacity to develop, or to enhance, upgrade the online platforms, to develop really those elements. In this case, for example, in the case of this pandemic, and of course, the digital platform has been one part of the solution, but it can be that we need to develop further scenarios and stress tests to ensure that for next crisis, the education and training system are both prepared very well. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I took more time than granted to me. Thank you.
It's perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Ayadi, for this clear picture of the education and training context in the Mediterranean countries. No doubt the pandemic leaves a complicated situation. I'd like now to introduce Mr. Abdelaziz Jawani, who is Senior Capital Development Expert at the European Training Foundation, and who will provide further details of this study. Mr. Jaouani has over 30 years of professional experience, firstly as teacher and director of vocational and education and training and higher education schools, as well as field experience in managing EU skills reform programs. He has also been an entrepreneur in the textile and clothing sector in Morocco. Since 2007, Aziz is a senior expert on human capital development and skill system reform in the European Training Foundation, where he has been leading mainly structuring programs such as GEM, Governance and Employability in the Mediterranean, and Torino Process in all ETF partner countries. So I would like, I give you the floor, the screen on this, and be welcome.
Thank you, Cristina. Hello, everyone. Pleased to be with you. So I will try to share my presentation. I don't know if you can see it.
Not yet, but
so maybe it will come because I cannot see.
There we go.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the objective of my presentation is to provide you with a general and quick overview, because of time constraints, about the human capital development and use in the southern and eastern Mediterranean region. So this is in fact a separate another report which focused on human capital development, and in which the EMEA report was also how to say supporting this study. So during the sorry, because I cannot see my presentation, so I hope it's working. Now I am moving to the next slide. So the structure of my presentation, in the 15 minutes granted, I will try to go quickly through the global and regional context. And then we will focus on the human capital challenges in CEMED, and also the data corroborating these fundings and statements that I am saying, but I will not be able to go through all this data, but you can find it in the presentation. And then we will share with you rapidly the main priority for action that we think that needs to be addressed as a matter of priority. In any case, the executive summary of this study is part of the EMEA report in the annex. So you can have there also some details about this. So, but to be able to make my presentation and the funding of this report into context, I will say 2 words about ETF and Torino process. So ETF, the European Training Foundation, is an EU technical agency operating in the human capital development with a focus on vocational education and training in lifelong learning perspective. So, our partner countries are those that you can see in the screen. So we are working in CEMED region, we call it CEMED region, Maghreb and Mashrek, Eastern Europe, Western Balkan and Turkey, and Central Asia. Torino process is a flagship product of ETF. It's inspired largely from the Copenhagen process in the EU member states. And it's about monitoring the skills, the human capital development and skills systems and their performance in all our partner countries. So it's a participatory process that started in 2010. And now we are in the 5th round, 2018-2020. And Torino process cover all the partner countries that you see on the screen, except Turkmenistan. And all the funding that I am sharing with you today are based on the national Torino process report in these countries. So, but this report that I am presenting today is the regional report for the region, for the CEMED region. So it's only for, because we do a regional report by region. So here I am trying and wishing to simplify the human capital development and utilization, which is a very complex, of course, process. To give you an idea about the scope of Torino process analysis. So the human capital development and use, it's not as linear as you may think. It's more complicated. So you can see here that the human capital development, it's mainly through the education and training systems, but also through non-formal and informal learning. So, and you can see here, for example, between the two green spheres in an intersection, which represent the interaction between the learning systems and the labor market. This intersection is very important in terms of transition, because this means that there are schools that may ask the enterprise to support them in the learning process, for example, work-based learning or apprenticeship. And in this case, of course, the transition is easier. But also in the labor market, we might find enterprises asking the learning system or the schools to help them in upskilling and reskilling their employees. So the transition from school to work, but also transition from work to work, is very important through the traditional education system, or through upskilling and reskilling, or continuous training in general. So this intersection or interaction is not very, how to say, is not optimal in our region. And for that, the intersection is very small, because of course, when we have this interaction, the transition is easier. When we do apprenticeship, we are immediately operational. When we do upskilling and reskilling, we have this professional mobility and we can move from job to job. But the reality is that the transition is much more complicated in the region, and which leads us to this yellow circle, which I call availability or even stock of human capital. Sorry for stock, because it's a strong term when it comes to human being. But the reality is this group are the long-lasting unemployed. So the unemployed, of course, it's a loss, or at least outstanding capital that we are not using. But at least this population, they don't give up yet. They still active and looking for a job, which may be less the case for this gray cloud up that you can see there. So this is an important also population that the analysis try to cover, which is about inactivity, for example. All these people that are active, why they are not active? Did they give up definitely, or they may come back to the labor market? Are they fed up of looking for a job? Are they impeded to do so, etc.? And also immigration, of course, all this youth population that they are leaving their country. Why? How many are there returning? And then the needs, etc. The needs are this 15-24 aged youth that they are not in employment nor in education and training system. So this is the scope of our analysis, and we try to cover all these issues and population to understand their impact as human capital in the socio-economic in our partner countries. So our analysis is quite simple. So we look at the socio-demographic, economic, educational issues in a given country. we confront these issues to the policy responses that the country are making or not, and then we analyze the gaps. And these gaps will be the focus of our policy recommendation. So obviously, our countries in the region are different in terms of socioeconomic context, are different in terms of wealth distribution. They are different in terms of labor market prospect, etc. But they are all exposed to this global transformation. So CEMED will not escape to the technological and non-technological shifts that is happening now. The globalization, market integration and connectivity, climate change will have a big impact on socioeconomic and skills. And then the demographic shift, notably the aging population, including in CEMED. So if we would like to have a look to the socioeconomic context in our region, it's not really very great. We will see that there are a lot of issues. So in terms of demography, for example, the region is characterized by a youth population, a big and a high share of youth population. More than 50% of the population are under 24. And third of the population, youth population, are under 15, which explain the very high pressure on the labor market. This pressure, the current pressure, because of the 15-24, but also future pressure on the labor market because of this third population under 15. There is also a high level of immigration of educated person in particular. So the countries are, let's say that the more educated people they are living their countries, brain drain, while receiving low-skilled migrants. This is mainly the case in Lebanon and Jordan, but not only, because we can now see Syrian refugees in Morocco or sub-Saharan migrants in Tunisia, Algeria, or Morocco. So this is in terms of demography, sorry, this shift. On the economy, there is not enough job creation. And when we have some job creation, it's in general the low-skilled jobs that they are created, not high-skilled. There is a high share of self-employment in the region, and also micro and small enterprise. More than 95% of enterprises have less than 5 employees. And there is a significant informal sector. Estimations are talking about 4 out of 5 workers in Morocco in the informal sector, and 3 out of 5 in Egypt, Palestine, and Tunisia. This is also a very important feature on the economy in the region, and structural issue, I would say. Labor market. So the 2/3 of the working age population are unemployed or inactive. The inactivity is in the region, it's really a big challenge, not only because the inactivity in the region is the highest in the world, but worse, this inactivity seems to increase, which is even more worrying. Only 1 out of 4 women is on the labor market. This means that an average of 75% of women are not active, which of course justify the high inactivity in the region, and the inactivity means loss of human capital for the prosperity and the socioeconomic development of the country. 1/3 of youth is not, this youth 15-24, that they are not in employment nor in education and training, represents an average of 30% in all countries in the region. And then the education and skills. Here we witness a positive trend that the access is much more better in all countries, even for women. We have even some countries where the access to education and training is better for women than for men. Let's say the gap or the segregation is of women is not in the education in general, or not anymore in the education, but rather in the labor market. But we have this inverse correlation between education and employment. Means that more we are educated, less we have opportunity to find a job. And this is also a feature important in the scope of the socioeconomic context. So, and then we have a poor matching services. So we know that the mismatch is very important. Horizontal and vertical mismatch are very important because of lack of skills anticipation mechanism in the countries and the poor public employment services. So here, based on this, of course, as I said, we have the data that support this analysis. We know also that the countries are different, and their progress and development are not the same. They are all in different stage of development, including in terms of human capital. But it have considered that these three challenges are common for all countries and needs to be addressed as a matter of priority in all countries. So here I clustered this in three main issues. The first one is related to job creation. The second one is about social inclusion. And the third one is about education and training systems. So we can understand that there is a big underutilization of human capital that hamper growth and job creation because of all the things that we have signed: the inactivity, the gender gap, the negative incidence of horizontal and vertical mismatch, and the negative stock of net migration. Also, social inclusion, exclusion, and gender gap is a substantial loss of human capital potential for socioeconomic prosperity, of course, and we have explained why, but also because there is not enough participation, for example, in adult learning, in continuous training, what I was mentioning about upskilling and reskilling of job seekers, of women, of vulnerable population in general. The high level of informality, of course, exacerbates even more the social exclusion, and COVID-19 also, of course, as Reem said, is expected to exacerbate even more this inequality. So I need here to say that these human capital challenges are not the result of the pandemic. This is very important because these are structural challenges that have been there in the region before the pandemic, and they will remain if they are not addressed properly, of course. And then there is the insufficient preparedness to anticipate and address the future skills of demand preparedness of the education and training system. And here, Reem also mentioned this limited involvement of private sector in skills anticipation and development, education and training system. They are not enough flexible and resilient, and we have seen this as a reaction of the pandemic. And the lack of data and monitoring for evaluation, this is not only for education, but for the overall, we have a serious problem of data in the region. And of course, we cannot make policies, policy design, policy implementation, or policy update without having credible statistics and data. So, and then this is my last slide. I hope I am not out of time. So based on all these issues and the analysis of the gaps, as I said, between the challenges in human capital development and the policy responses, we came up with this 4 building block of recommendation that, of course, they are developed in the report. First of all, building strong skills partnership for better resilience. So This is a partnership is very important because the education and training system will never ever be able to accompany this global transformation and shift that I presented in the beginning of my presentation without establishing and building very strong partnership with the private sector. And this is an issue in the region, as you know. Even if here also we have some good examples. For example, in the Maghreb, mainly through this partnership that they are, but they remain at national level. We don't have, when we go to sectorial or the regional or the local level, this partnership is lost. So we don't have enough collaboration and cooperation between education and training system and the private sector. This partnership needs also to cover the financial mechanism, and Reem also mentioned this issue of financial mechanism. The budget of education and training in the region is based mainly on the state. So state is taking in charge. All the countries in the region have education and training as priority. But when you see the budget for education, they are rather decreasing because they cannot, the state cannot ensure all these big budgets for education and training. And then we need to make partnership also here with the private sector to finance part of we have some good practices that maybe our colleague Najib Hammoudsi will share with us one of them today. But the financing mechanism and their diversification is very important through, of course, training levy, for example, or through even work-based learning, because work-based learning, the fact that the enterprise are hosting part of the training, they are contributing indirectly to the financing and to the diversification of financing mechanisms. This is also a very, so the second block of recommendation is about lifelong learning. Culture to insert digital and green transition that they are not coming, but they are already there. So this lifelong learning, it's mainly about, it's not about initial training. Of course, we need to ameliorate also initial training, but it's mainly about adult training, upskilling and reskilling with a focus, I would say, on vulnerable groups like job seekers, women, or others. And then the skills provision should ease the labor market transition. And we have seen the difficulties in the transition through the unemployed, the long-lasting unemployment, but also all this population migration and needs and inactivity is also certainly due in part to this. So here we are proposing to create a lifelong career guidance, because career guidance it's missing. You may have some career guidance in VET or in general education, but it's not generalized. It's not a systemic approach with career guidance. Regulate and extend the work-based learning. Work-based learning is certainly the best learning way to improve the transition and to ease the placement of the graduate, of course. The key competency for lifelong learning, I made here the link to the EU key competencies to have an idea about what is key competence. We don't have time to go in details. And in the report, we are focusing as a matter of urgency, the digitalization, of course, and the entrepreneurial learning for the job creation, but also soft or life skills that are always mentioned by the employers as important as well. So last and not least, the data for better skills anticipation and matching and monitoring labor market outcomes. And I will stop here. You will find, as I said, some data that I didn't have time to present, but you can have a look about the population, about the self-employment, inactivity, needs, the education paradox I mentioned, but here you will have concrete statistics and data, the gender gap, very important. Also some data about the competitiveness, innovation, etc. The lifelong learning and adult learning. We don't have enough statistics, but we have some for some countries. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jawani. Thank you for this presentation and for providing further data on the socio-economic context on CEMED and the recommendations to face these challenges regarding this interaction between training and labor market to make it optimal. Thank you very much. We move forward now. We open the panel to 3 discussants that will provide an overview of the impact of this pandemic on education and training on their own countries or institutions. So I like very much to introduce Mohammed Elrazzaz, who is senior expert of the Union for the Mediterranean. Mr. Elrazzaz is Barcelona-based staff, member of the Secretariat of the Union of the Mediterranean since 2013. He's part of the Economic Development and Employment Division at the Secretariat. He is in charge of creative economy, digital economy, and social economy. Prior to his engagement with the UFM, he had worked for 10 years as financial analyst and head of investor relations at the Commercial International Bank, Egypt's premier bank, where he received the Goldman Sachs Transaction of the Year award in 2006 for the successful gearing of the bank's shareholding structure. In parallel, he is professor of Mediterranean heritage at the International University of Catalonia in Barcelona since 2015. His second book, titled The Mediterranean, A Shared Heritage, was published by the Euro-Mediterranean University in 2018. Mr. Elrazzaz holds a BA in Economics, postgraduate in History, University of Granada, and MA in Arts and Cultural Management in Barcelona, in the UIC University. Be very welcome, Mr. Elrazzaz. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for this very extensive introduction. I want to first ask and make sure that you can all hear me well. Yes? Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, it's always fantastic to hear from Dr. Ayadi and Mr. Aziz Jawani because they have a lot of knowledge on this issue. Actually, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and please allow me to start by congratulating the European Training Foundation for the excellent work done with the Torino process, and also to congratulate the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association and Economists for launching this very important study, very timely as well, with a focus on the Arab Mediterranean countries. It is precisely this study that I would like to talk about, because the methodology is, to my mind, an excellent methodology. The examination of preparedness and early warning systems, the examination of crisis management systems, and also crisis recovery systems makes perfect sense in light of what we are talking about here, and also in light of how interconnected these 3 pillars really are. So I think the approach is perfect, but beyond the approach and beyond the methodology, the report opens our eyes to very important facts, some of them drastic, regarding the serious deficiencies and the gaps that make education and training systems in the Arab Mediterranean countries far from resilient. It's something that we already knew, but sometimes studies like this with scientific based and backed evidence and statistical data and a thorough analysis and a vision, they also help to put things in perspective. So the situation on the ground could be even more aggravated if we take into consideration the possibility of further complications with the current pandemic situation in light of the emergence of new variants and new transmutations, and hopefully not, but uncertainty still looms, not only for the region, for the entire world. The pandemic is obviously far from over, and I know that a further assessment would need to be done for the education and training and the accompanying policies in general. We know, of course, that this fragility comes at a time when education in general finds itself pressed to adapt to other disruptions, other than the humanitarian crisis. I'm talking here about such disruptions as technological and moral disruptions emanating from the digital transformation, the fourth industrial revolution, the profusion of new technologies. And I'm talking about a moral disruption emanating from a liquid modernity, as Zygmunt Bauman once coined it, that is becoming an ethereal modernity, dehumanizing entire communities, and sowing the seeds of more uncertainty about the future, especially among the younger generations. Now, we know that the labor market in the Arab world in general and in the MENA region in particular suffers very high levels of unemployment, structural unemployment, and particularly among women, youth, and vulnerable communities. But in addition, there's a serious issue with the informal economy. Informal employment is at sky-high rates in many of these countries. There's a problem of a serious brain drain, as the report also mentioned, and huge gender and digital gaps. Now, the poor quality of education also means that young graduates facing new realities and for very practical reasons would have to undergo a process of unlearning things that they had learned, because they find out that they don't function in the real world. This disconnection between two spheres that otherwise need to be thoroughly connected, talking here about academia and labor markets, has its price, and it's taxing the entire system. And of course, we know that the unlearning process is much more complicated and taxing than learning anew. The COVID-19 crisis, as already mentioned by the colleagues, and as you all would know, has only further aggravated these socioeconomic realities and exposed all the vulnerabilities that the system, or may I say the systems, have. At the UFM Secretariat, we are, of course, no strangers to the portfolio of higher education and research, nor to economic development and employment, because these are two of our main areas of priority and engagement with our stakeholders. So regional cooperation efforts in the field of higher education, research and innovation, as well as vocational training and mobility, play a very important role, an essential role in achieving a positive agenda for the youth in the Mediterranean, because of the potential, of course, on increasing employability, promoting intercultural dialogue, and preventing extremism, which is one education here, and the poor quality of education is one of the root causes of such phenomena that we've been living for over a decade in the region, including violence, extremism, radical discourse, gender violence, to the end of the very long list. Now, the activities of the UFM area of higher education and research also aim to contribute to the global development agenda, particularly goal number 4, if I remember correctly, of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, I have it here actually, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And also SDGs 8.6, reduce the proportion of youth not in employment, education, or training, the famous needs, or the infamous needs. Now, back to the report, I think that the findings and the recommendations of the report only confirm our, let's say, compass when it comes to the strategic objectives of our work on higher education and research. And these, for your reference, include strengthening the contribution of the UFM Secretariat to regional dialogue fora in the field, including the development of regional dialogue processes on higher education, internationalization and academic mobility, and on vocational education and training, scaling up learning opportunities in a Euro-Mediterranean environment, fostering regional initiatives and projects in the area of school-to-work transition, the transition from education to the labor market, and contributing to the implementation of the 2017 Ministerial Declaration on Strengthening Cooperation through Research and Innovation. And this was the last ministerial conference for the Union for the Mediterranean held on higher education and research. Obviously, the time has come for another ministerial, and we're hoping for one in the very near future. I would also like to highlight that the member states, in the joint statement that came out of the co-presidency on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona process that was held last year, they agreed to focus on 5 areas of priority for the coming years. So the UFM Secretariat will be focusing its efforts and its initiatives and mobilizing its capacities and resources to tackle these 5 areas. 3 of these areas are intricately connected to higher education and research and skill development. These are sustainable and inclusive economic and human development, social inclusiveness and equality as an essential element in socioeconomic development, and digital transformation. So we all have clear connection to this area of priority that we are talking about today. And moreover, the UFM progress report on regional integration, which will be launched this month on the 27th of May, has a full chapter dedicated to higher education and research, including key takeaways, findings, and policy recommendations, which we will be very glad to share with you in due time when the report is launched, of course. And here I would like to say that EMEA and Dr. Ayadi in particular were among the architects of this report, because this report builds on a very thorough study on specific performance indicators that laid the foundation for this report. So I will be very happy to share with you all the findings once the report is launched on the 27th of May. I really do not want to abuse the time mark, so please allow me to maybe end on a note. It's a Chinese proverb, if I may, that says, if you are planning for a year, you sow rice. If you are planning for a decade, you plant a tree. If you are, however, planning for a lifetime, you educate people. Unfortunately, in the Arab world, the focus seems to be on rice rather than on trees or on education. And this, as we all know, is not exactly a strategy for survival. I really hope that the decision makers and the interlocutors would take very good note of the findings and the recommendations of this study and of the work done also by the European Training Foundation, because the recommendations and the takeaways are very sound and very clear. The time to act is now. I thank you very much. Always glad to be here with EMEA and MNES and ETF, both personally and also in my professional capacity as a staff member of the UFM Secretariat. Thank you very much, and over to you, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elrazzaz, for this intervention and for this wise Chinese proverb. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure now to introduce Professor Mohammed Al-Shinawi, who is advisor to the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research of Egypt. He has a very, very extensive and interesting biography curriculum. So I let you read it, but I'm going to give some of it. So he is vice president of the Galala University in Egypt. He's professor in the Department of General Surgery, Faculty of Medicine, Ain Shams University, Cairo, Egypt. As I said, he's advisor, advisor to the Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research, adjunct professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine, Maryland University, Baltimore, in the USA, He co-chairs, he is co-chair of the Partnership for Research and Innovation in the Mediterranean Area Initiative, the Prima Foundation in Barcelona. Board member of the National Training Institute, member of the UFM Bureau for Research and Innovation, fellow of the American College of Surgeons, and consultant of general surgery in several hospitals in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And longer CV, but be very, very welcome, Mr. Al-Shinawi. As responsible about all international relations also, sorry, Mr. Shinawi, what has been the response of Egypt to this COVID-19 pandemic in terms of education and scientific research?
Thank you so much for this introduction, and I highly appreciate your kind invitation to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the response of the Egyptian the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research. And also, I would like to congratulate you for the report that you had released, which is highly appreciated. And I hope that many of the Arab countries will benefit from this report. Allow me to share my presentation. I saw in the report that you were talking a lot about the schools in Egypt, and I would like to focus more about the response of the Egyptian Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research and what happened in the higher education system in Egypt. So allow me to share my screen. Perfect. So can you hear me well? Perfect. So I'll be talking about some points very thoroughly about the higher education in Egypt, some facts and figures to see the challenge that we faced, some of the COVID-19 that we all know are the statistics, what were the immediate and ongoing challenges that happened in the higher education, and what some of the procedures, I'll not talk about all the procedures because this will take a longer time, and some of the international cooperation that we would like to highlight with the World Bank. And of course, we had a lot of cooperation also with the UFM and with Professor Elrazzaz. And I would like to stress also about the role of the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research in how the response of the universities and research centers to all of a sudden pandemic that happens and how we responded, and a conclusion. Very fast going through about the higher education system in Egypt. We are talking about 27 public universities, more than 30 private universities. During the pandemic, we were able to have 4 new national universities. This is plus the international branch campuses, and this is new universities in Egypt. It was a new system after a law that was integrated in 2018. Also, a new 3 technological universities, plus private higher institutes and private middle institutes, plus Elrazzaz University, of course. Here, I'm talking about the system that has more than 3.2 million students, with more than 122,000 teaching staff and around 600,000 postgraduate and around 100,000 international students. So when the pandemic came, we had to move fast and to adapt our system and adapt all of that to overcome this pandemic. Looking also at some of the facts, you'll find that we had more than, plus the universities, we have also the research centers with around 135,000 researchers, teaching staff, and assistants. COVID-19, some facts, we know that we are reaching millions all over the world, and unfortunately, a lot of death around the world. Egypt also is not away from that with all these numbers, and yesterday, the government and the Prime Minister took some more closure actions, and for the schools, they ended a week ago, except for the last year, which is the Sanawiyya Amma, or the last year in high school. They have to continue while others stop. For the Ministry of Higher Education, I will talk more through. So what happened that we had immediately in March 2020, we have to have all of a sudden closure of all higher education institutes. But at the same time, we had the technical challenge to maintain the education process ongoing, and at the same time, deal with any illness of the staff and our students. We had a lot of research work that is ongoing, and all of a sudden closure, we had to find a process to keep this research ongoing. There were millions of pounds that are invested in this research work, and of course, taking care about all the around 100,000 international students that all over Egypt, and to care about them if they want to go back to their countries, they want to continue. All of this was also a lot of challenges. These were some of the immediate challenges that we faced, but there is still ongoing challenges that we are facing. For instance, the financing of the higher education institutes. How are we going to keep the mobility with all the closure that's happening of the international students and the problems with the airlines and the airports and all of this stuff? The research cooperation has to go on, especially with those of the international one, with the ongoing funding. And as Professor Reem was mentioning, the platforms and the online education, and it's not only about the online education, but the quality, how to keep this going and maintained. One of the problems that we are facing in Egypt, and not only in Egypt, but I think in the Arab world, that the online education was not approved in many countries, although there are many degrees that are online, but still full online degrees were not that approved. But we had fortune that in 2018 we formed online education. So during the pandemic, this online education committee fastened its work, and we started to adapt what's called the hybrid education. And it was very crucial to adapt this. So I will give you now what's happening that in the practical faculties, like the School of Medicine, the School of Science, and all of that, we are working on 3 days in campus and 2 days online, while for the humanities and the other specialities, we are working 3 days online and 2 days in campus if needed. On 14th of March 2020, there was an immediate action from the government saying that there is no physical attendance in universities and we have to transfer on 100% online education. So at the Ministry of Higher Education, we started to have different committees that's oversighting what's happening. There was a preparation committee for the university hospitals to be ready as a part of our role, with 115 university hospitals all over Egypt, serving millions of patients and all over the country. It was very important to show how that we adapt to this crisis by having a committee for COVID-19 research and trying to put some, having some research to adapt to this crisis, and a higher committee for viruses to monitor all the situation internally in Egypt, in the region, and all over the whole world. In 24th of March, with more than 100 million Egyptian pounds, there was an open call by the 2 funding agencies in Egypt. One of the points that you mentioned during the presentation was the cooperation with the private sector. And actually, this was very important. We started more intensive cooperation with the Ministry of Communication and the telecom companies all over Egypt, with 4 telecom companies, to work on the platforms, how to improve, having national platforms plus the international known platforms, working on the internet capacity, how to be sure that all our students, we're talking about 3.2 million students, to be sure that they have the communication to the platforms, how to maintain these platforms and support both online education and exams. And actually, during for any faculties, the last year has to be examined. So we didn't exempt them from the examination, so that they are, when they are graduated, they have their final exams. While for the previous years, we have like an alternative approach, but the final year, they have to have their exams. And this year, all years has to have their own, to have their exams. We managed to upload more than 85% of the needed education material in a very short time, and we are continuing to upload them. And we made a good use of one of the examples that we see as a successful example in the Egyptian Knowledge Bank. It was not an easy road. There were a lot of challenges, especially with the internet capacity and keeping the platforms and improving the platforms and choosing the right platform for every university and for every discipline. Cooperation, we had many cooperations, but I would like to highlight the cooperation that happened between the Ministry of Higher Education and the World Bank, and it goes with what we were talking about the employability and the relevance of higher education. And it was very challenging to start this work during the pandemic, but we managed to finalize the first draft in January 2021, and we are working more to finalize this about the Egypt higher education policy note about employability and relevance of higher education graduates. And then I think this exactly where my colleagues, the previous speakers were talking about, and the relevance of this higher education and the, how to cooperate between the industry and the needs of the market, not only the local market, but the regional market and the international market with the higher education. And this is one of the strategies that the Ministry of Higher Education is adapting these days. Also, it was very important to have a capacity development for our staff. So we started a series of webinars with the World Bank also and with the IFC, International Federation of Cooperation. And if you go thoroughly about the topics, we're talking about the future of work, the digital skills, and we were sharing experience with different countries, our colleagues from Morocco, from Tunisia, from Thailand, from Denmark, the rapid transition to online learning during the COVID-19. It was very important to talk about the student financing mechanism, about the institutional financing. This was very important action that we took to see how are we going to change our strategy, our rules, our governors, to adapt to this pandemic. And this work, we finished our first batch in 22nd of April, and we are having today actually another round of discussion with the World Bank to continue this work. It was very challenging to have 4 new national universities to open during the pandemic, but I thank God that we managed to open 3 of them, which are Galala University, King Salman, and Al Alamein International University in different locations all over Egypt, and New Mansoura will open this year. And they already started in 2020 during the pandemic, receiving around 2,500 students, and it was a real challenge, but we managed to do it with all the hassles that were behind that, plus the one of the international branch campuses. The technological universities also was a new trend in Egypt, as my colleague from Morocco was talking about the applied sciences universities or the technological learning or the TVET. And we managed to have 3 new, those who are in blue, those already opened 3, and there are another 6 to join the system within 2 to 3 years. And if you look at the map, and I insisted to write it in Arabic to show that it's all over Egypt in different places according to the needs of these areas. And here, I know I will not run out of time. I wanted to show how that we need to adapt according to the pandemic and to have the crisis management. And the research committee that was formed managed to coordinate between different, more than 70 universities. So we were able to have more than 201 as number 1 in Africa with clinical trials. And what was very important, that many of these clinical trials were in cooperation with international entities all over the Mediterranean region and worldwide, and they were supported by international organizations like the WHO, the NIH, and many others, the European Union. And this resulted in more than 1,332 publications until now. From Egypt, coming a second after South Africa in the continent. And I would like to highlight that also the higher education system was fast enough Now there are 2 vaccines that are going to be developed from Egypt, and they already published about those 2 vaccines, and we are in the final forms to have those 2 vaccines. And this shows that the research and the higher education system has to adapt, because having those 2 vaccines with all the vaccine that's ready will help us to return back to the norm, inshallah, very soon. And those were published in a very prestigious journals, the Journal of Vaccine. This is the work of the people from the NRC and in cooperation with the United States and the other team in clinical trials. I could conclude by saying that we had a big challenge as regards the higher education system in Egypt, and we were managed to develop alternative plans to complete the educational process, and still we are having some challenges, but we are trying to adapt our system accordingly. It was very important to encourage the scientific research to conduct the research on COVID-19 and to give the finance and to allocate resources to do this. The procedures that were taken were trying to adapt according to, as a quick response to the pandemic. International cooperation is crucial. We had several and hundreds of webinars with different countries, thousands, to see the protocols, adapt new protocols for the COVID-19 and how to change our system accordingly. There are a lot of achievement, but a lot of challenges. And I would like to finish but a proverb that, as Dr. Elrazzaz was saying, but this is an African proverb that says, if you want to fly fast, fly alone. But if you want to fly far, we have to fly all of us together. Thank you so much. Back to you, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jawani. Thank you very much for this intervention, explaining the efforts by the Egyptian government, both in the public and private sector, to adapt the education and the research system to this pandemic situation. Thank you very much. Let me introduce our next guest. Is Professor Najib Hamouti. He is expert in employability and higher vocational education with more than 20 years of experience in the field of training and managing skills projects in Morocco and the MENA region. His main areas of interest include employability, skills policies, education, training, governance, and promotion of youth entrepreneurship. Najib is currently the head of a career center at Aziz, a graduate school in Casablanca. He has received the Foundation's Award for Innovation from the Global Career Service Summit in April 2021. So be very welcome, Mr. Hamouti. The screen is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank first EMEA and ETA.
We hear you very far. I don't know if it's only myself or... Yeah, maybe the mic.
Is it fine like this? Can you hear me now?
Let's see.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's working better.
Yes,
thank you.
Nice. Thank you very much. I don't know if I'm the luckiest person to be in this meeting because I'm speaking as the last speaker today. First, I'd like to make a brief introduction about the institution I represent here, which is Aziz. We are a graduate school based in Casablanca, and we provide training and education in engineering, production management, and logistics. And we are historically the engineering school of textile industry in Morocco. To contextualize my intervention, I'm going to speak first about the impact of the pandemic on the Moroccan social and economic sector, but just really very briefly. Then I will provide a case study of how the crisis was managed, and maybe I cannot find better a case study than in terms of accessibility than how is it managed the crisis. The pandemic, Morocco was among those also hard hit by the pandemic, so which resulted in the loss of almost 1.25 million jobs in Morocco. And when you see the economic spectrum in Morocco, 60% of the jobs are provided by the informal sector, which means also that 60% of people, or maybe less or more, who have lost their jobs are not traced, are not tracked. We don't know where they are and what they do, because they don't have social security number, and they don't have even maybe some of them who are really self-employed in very modest jobs, don't even have maybe bank accounts. So that was also one of the challenges. And the sectors which were hardly hit by the pandemic, maybe four, including tourism, of course, so agriculture, textile, retail, and construction. This is where we have lost many jobs, and where production came to a standstill for many months, and which resulted in unemployment, rise of unemployment. So it jumped from 9% to 11%. So we lost 2% in job opportunities and job creation. And the other drawback is that not only we lost jobs, which means unemployment, but we also witnessed the new phenomenon, which is underemployment. So because of the crisis, companies have started, those who restarted their activity, and they needed labor. They started, not all of them, of course, we are not generalizing, but many of them were started hiring in very sometimes incredibly low, offering low salaries, low wages to new recruits. So which means also underemployment and employment in very dire circumstances. Moroccan economy is they say we are a community of SMEs. So SMEs are more than 80% of our economy, and hence they didn't have enough reserves to face the pandemic, and all this comes down again to losing jobs. On the level of ESIT, the graduate school I work for, in March we stopped activity on the campus, and everybody went home. Students, as well as most of the workforce, of our workforce, I mean our employees. So the reaction was taken to the pandemic was taken in 3 levels. So the first level was how to face this crisis in terms of managing the infrastructure of the college, of the center. So we formed a task force team, mixed task force. Even the leadership of the school was involved in it, and the purpose was to deal with all the security issues and the security protocols, how to implement, because that was really something new, something we didn't maybe like everybody expect to happen. So we had to build maybe from scratches, and of course relying on the available data from the ministries and the instructions we also received from the Ministry of Health. So we needed to be very tough about implementing, and not only tough but very responsive in implementing these new regulations on the campus. So the change was really very fast. So the second task force was about the provision of education. The provision of education in the sense that how can we guarantee the continuity of education when students are not in the campus, which is a situation which we have never faced before. So in this sense, we had to first to do, as Winston Churchill, we had to do the best with what we have. So we found out that one of the products we have purchased not long ago, which was used for mostly for emailing. I don't want to name it, but let's say Microsoft Office 365. If I'm not doing any commercial here. So that was used mainly for emailing and other, if you like, office organization stuff. But we discovered that one of the tools that we have been using scarcely, which is Microsoft Teams, which we used maybe scarcely for meeting, has risen to the surface as the main tool which will help us ensure a kind of pedagogic continuity and stay in touch with students. When we say stay in touch with students, it was, of course, we had the challenge because we had modules and we had a program to follow. But we were also thinking about, if you like, the mental health of students and the psychological health of students. So we thought, because they were confined, locked down at home, so the best way to attenuate this condition of being locked down sometimes in some remote places was to guarantee staying in touch with students. And here I would like to congratulate my colleagues, course leaders who were at the front line, ensuring that everybody is connected and everybody is able to follow the courses. And stay in this task force, which is a pedagogic task force. We have almost 150 lecturers and trainers, some of them permanent trainers, some of them associate trainers and lecturers. And some of these collaborators have never used distance learning, either as a tool or as a way of teaching. So we had to train them also on how to use these terms. And I can guarantee you that it was really a war room where we had, people who were in charge of this had to give really sometimes person-to-person training to some of the lecturers and trainers. The third thing we had to deal with was because it was also a year of graduation, so we had also to deal with the question of staying in touch with the students, who have graduated and helping them look for a job even in times of crisis, and not only to look for a job, but also not to lose hope. So in this sense, our Career Center has digitized its services. So there was a shopping list. We used the shopping list. For example, we purchased professional Zoom subscription, and this has allowed us to cater for the needs of face-to-face, although being distanced, face-to-face coaching, face-to-face correcting CVs and simulation of, and also we use this to keep in touch with our graduates and do, for example, some webinars on job search, career services, etc. Before I finish, I would like to stress something very important. I think to a great extent we have been successful in guaranteeing the continuity of the pedagogic activity on the campus during the period of the lockdown, and when the lockdown was over, we had also to guarantee that a percentage of students can come back to the campus physically. For a period of time, they would then leave and other students would come, so that we can have at least students, especially where we were thinking about those who have just joined school for the first time and they have never seen the school. So we guarantee that we have very maximum security. The protocol was, used in the most strict way. So we created small, fragmented, if you like, classes into very small groups, and we have been flexible enough that everybody could get some of courses, half of them online and half of them in person. And I think the thing which is, if you like, the magic word in this, which helped us manage the crisis with so much responsiveness, is the fact that we are an institution which enjoys a high level of autonomy. We are the byproduct of a partnership between the Moroccan government and the private sector. So, and this special status we have allowed us to have an agile management system in place, which allows us to take decisions quickly, and also we need to purchase quickly. So instead of, for example, going through a long process of bureaucracy in order to acquire a new solution, especially because of the rise of digitization. So it really takes less time than any other place. So I think this is what my take on this. And in the near future, we have also a lasting impact. This question of managing the crisis had a lasting impact on our institution, because we decided that the hybrid system will be adopted forever. Okay. And here I would like to thank everybody, and I will be very happy to answer any questions. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hammoudi, for your intervention. We'll be now actually taking questions from the participants. And before, we're going to post 2 questions on our chat so participants can answer them, and I will be reading them. Okay. So, and then we will move to, then we'll be moving to the discussion. So I don't know if...
Can you please put the poll that we prepared on screen? So they will come on screen, Cristina.
I don't know if I have that myself. I'm confused here. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So how did the education system perform to respond to the challenges during the pandemic? And I can't see the answers now. So now participants have to answer. But I can't see the result. I guess we should have the result at the end.
No, that's fine. It will come, the result. Just give it a bit of time.
Okay. So let's wait for that result. So here we have it. High level of school closures, 30%, adapted fast using various digital platforms, 40%, and very poorly, 30%. So this is what the participants answered after these interventions. And I think we have another question. The second question is, how do you see the education and training system post-COVID-19? So one of the answers is more investment in digital education and training systems. Second, more private-public partnership and increasing education training quality. And the third one will be less investment in public education. So let's wait for the participants to answer this second question. And in a few moments, we'll have this result. So here there is. So more investment in digital education and training systems, 64%. More private-public partnership and increasing education training quality. The response, 36%. Less investment in public education, 0%. So this is the results of this second poll for the participants. And now we are going to move to some questions for the speakers that I'm taking from this Q&A box. I had a question for Mr. Shinawi. Sorry, just very quickly. So the question to Professor Mohammed Al-Shinawi is, what are the plans of EDUC to reduce the urban-rural gap, mainly linked to the digital divide?
Thank you so much for this question, because this was one of the challenges. And that's why I highlighted during my presentation that we directly contacted the Ministry of Communication in Egypt to work very hard on adapting some new strategies and working on the infrastructure for the universities. And at the same time, working also to reach the rural areas. But we involved the private sector here when we talked with the 4 main telecom companies that are providing the service in Egypt to make special offers and special SIM cards for the students with higher internet gigabytes or something like that, so that they could enter to the internet with a lesser cost. And it was sold all over the country. And this was as a fast and action taken by the ministry with these private companies to allow the students to be able to be connected to the different platforms and the education, to keep the education system going. And for the long term, we are discussing a lot of options with the Ministry of Communication, especially with the challenges of reaching to the rural areas.
Thank you very much for this answer. We are going to try to keep it short as this one, these answers. I have another one coming from Facebook, and there is a participant that he gives thanks to all participants for their representations. I addressed 3 questions to you. I think that would be also for Mr. Shinawi or maybe for Professor Hamouti that could respond. According to a recent study of the World Bank, today a child born in the Middle East and North Africa region will reach as adult only 57% of the productive capacities that he or she could have accumulated by having benefited from it a complete education and perfect health. So how can governments in MENA region reduce the gap in productive capacity? Can social dialogue play an important role in improving the resilience of the education and training systems in the period of the health crisis? So this is the question. I don't know who wants to prepare to answer.
Okay, if you want, I can venture an answer. First, I'd like to thank the participant for this question. Of course, the situation is getting more and more alarmed on this question of the figure of 57% is mainly a little bit scary to look at. So the governments are asked to respond quickly. It's really, the COVID when it came, coronavirus, the crisis when it came, it didn't give us time to say, I will give you 1 year to find the vaccine, but we had the whole humanity was mobilized to find the vaccine quickly. And this is what should happen. Our governments, of course, through dialogue, nothing can be achieved without dialogue with all social partners and all stakeholders. And the second thing is that there is a need to align ourselves with what is happening around us in terms of the governance of higher education institutions and also vocational institutions, in pushing the partnership with the private sector to a higher level, because either some of our colleagues who may not in the public sector may not agree with us, but I think the more you introduce a logic of the private sector, which is the logic of entrepreneurship, logic of accountability, objectives, indicators, when you introduce this logic into the management of the public sector, it will give, I think, more surely the same result we get in the private sector, which is productivity, profitability, and also, except that in this case we have a social return on investment, creating opportunities for young people in the MENA region with all its mixed populations of Arabs, Amazigh, Africans, etc. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have another question for Mr. Elrazzaz. Let's try to keep it very short because we are running out of time. So what will be the role of the UFM in the recovery process?
It's impossible to give a short answer here, but I will just say that since day one, we have been mobilizing all our capacities and resources and our ecosystem in general, our partners, our interlocutors, to make sure that any response to the COVID that we work on would be inclusive, responsible, and sustainable. If the question is focused on higher education and research, which is the focus of today's webinar, I would be very happy to facilitate a link or a contact to colleagues from our higher education and research department, as well as links from the UFM website. You'll find all the information actually on our website.
Great, thank you very much for this short answer. And one last question for Mr. Jawani. Also, let's try to keep it short. So what is the follow-up of the evaluation of the Torino process?
I hope the implementation. So, but anyway, the follow-up, we are now sharing our fundings with all the countries in the region, the 13th of July. And we will ask them, we will submit the recommendation, and we will ask them if they agree with these recommendations and the issues, of course, and how they see the best way to implement these recommendations. Because we know that in terms of implementation, there is only the country inside their context that they can implement this recommendation. So indeed, implementation and action, and not anymore, all these issues, the countries are aware about them. The problem now is the action. And thank you.
Thank you very much for these answers, these short answers also. And now I'd like to ask all speakers and participants, panelists, everyone who is here today to switch on the camera, because we are going to take a group picture. We are 38 participants, so we are going to be very small, but So I'm asking everyone to switch on their camera so we can take this picture. Oh, there we go. Great. I don't know if someone...
invite Georges to take the picture.
So I don't know if we are already, we should keep smiling or...
1 second, because I need to have his green light because he's following two meetings, sorry.
Okay, no problem, no problem.
Thank you so much.
We should keep smiling or...
Yes, we have the picture.
Ah, perfect.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Cristina, before you break, I would like to first of all thank very much the panelists, also ETF specifically, all the team, Sabina, Abdelaziz, and all the team who has been very close to us during this few months of work, during the evaluation of the Torino process, and I hope it will be implemented. I think you will have a large challenge to ensure that these recommendations, and very good recommendations that you have produced, are really acted on the ground. I think this is a clear challenge. But also I'm very happy to have collaborated with you all during this very interesting, I would say, journey. So a few months journey, which allowed us really to interact with the elements on the education and training systems. Of course, the picture overall, it's not very, I would say, it's a bit bleak, but we are hopeful that some fundamental reforms will be put in place. And then the pandemic provides the opportunity really to develop private-public partnership type of solutions, which could be used and also upscaled in different countries. I think this is the way forward. At the same time, we haven't talked about the digital divide, and this is a topic which we have certainly talked about in the report. I think the digital divide nowadays is clear, and clear infrastructure development is needed, and also, of course, linked to financing, knowing that the governments and the countries in this region are suffering from high indebtedness, and I think this should be highlighted also going forward. So again, this research will continue. We have a monitor at the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association on the consequences of COVID and how to see how to follow this resilience model that we are developing also in terms of preparedness, crisis management, and recovery. All the information is on the website, on our website. We will continue monitoring with key indicators in the labor market as well, and education and training policy. So please, all of this information is accessible. You can have a look at it on our platforms and website. And the collaboration with ETF will continue. I'm looking at Abdelaziz on screen, and also with the UFM. I'm looking at Mohammed. And I thank very, very much Professor Shinawi and Professor Hamouti for sharing their views with us from Morocco and from Egypt. This is, for us, a very important and timely, I would say, event, which really allows us to build together and co-develop together toward a recovery and sustainable recovery path. And I would like also to thank Cristina, who is a correspondent of Euronews in Spain, for taking the time and moderating very to the timely, and respecting the time also this webinar. And I thank you all. I thank all the participants for sharing this moment with us today. Our next webinar at EMEA will be, in fact, debt transparency and sustainability, with the focus on infrastructure development and financing. And for us, infrastructure, in terms of the education system, for example, is the digital platform, and how to ensure the digital platform are really reaching also the rural areas. And this is a question I wanted to ask Professor Mohammed Shenawi, whether all the activities that they have done would also reach the rural areas. And this is where the problem is. And I think there is a lot to debate, this bridge, a gap between what I call the inequality gap between urban and rural, especially in digital platforms and so on. So I think we continue debating and trying to co-develop together solutions for putting these countries into resilient, inclusive, equitable, and sustainable path, hopefully post-COVID. So this is it. Thank you very much all, and I hope to see you in the next event on the 17th of June. Cristina, would you like to add the final word? I leave it for you.
I just want to thank you all for also being on time and for this very, very, very interesting webinar where I learned also a lot. So I want to thank you all also for the invitation and the moderation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Ciao.